far as being a history professor and all that, this has been a big year. You can imagine. He's spoken at several different places, helping people prepare historically, all those things. So we're glad to be able to have him here this morning with us to share this message on the Declaration of Independence. And so I'm going to pray. Then I'm going to ask Dr. Carl to come up and share with us. God, we thank you for these moments that we have together as your people, as freedom. Thank you for the church building you've given us, God, that we can come together peacefully. And Lord, I pray you be with Carl this morning. You give him just the ability to remember those things that he's prepared and study, God, that we may have hearts and minds that are ready to learn. And we are so thankful, again, for America and how you bless this country. And Lord, just bless this service this morning. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Dr. Durham.
All right. Does the microphone work okay for Scott's here. I don't know where Scott is. I'll try to be a little louder so it feels like it's not fully getting out there to you. Maybe there's a line somewhere in the process. So this is Preston and I said, what do you may talk about? Because I want to talk about, we're doing something for July 4th. And I'm like, well, there's a lot I could talk about because I've certainly had the privilege of, it's been a fun year for the past really year and a half for me, kind of working on this. So here's the real title. So the providence of God has done this. All the quotes on here mostly are from John Adams, who is my favorite. So you're going to hear a lot about John Adams just because I love him so much. And then I said, Preston, this one we choose the title for. Now it's going to pop a lot. The creation of the United States when the Declaration of Independence set in motion, quote, a revolution, the most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of nations. I think this is kind of something that gets lost to us at times, now probably too. Because we're here in 2026, we're here in 250, and because we're here in 250, it sort of feels like, well, this is just who we are and what we do. This has been one of the challenges in general for people because if you look at the world, most of the world looks like us. Most nations have done some kind of replication, variations, of course, of the idea of what we're going to land on here at the end, in the sense of why does it stand out? Right? We're not the only revolution that's ever happened. And there are many before we came along. So it's kind of like, well, why does it matter so much? Or why is it just arrogance on our part to claim that ours is somehow special or ours somehow rises to the top, or as Adam said, is the most unexpected and remarkable of any in the history of nations? In 2026, when you look around, you can see lots of other countries that are like us. And so things that we take for granted or things we set in motion that we're going to come back to at the end, kind of like the real reason. We see those everywhere, so it's kind of like, yeah, whatever. And one of the things that I guess I want to lean into helping you kind of think about why our country matters, why the Declaration matters, not just this year when we're celebrating 250, but next year when it's 251, or last couple of years when it's 248, it still really matters, is because when Jefferson and the gang wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, those were not self-evident at all, because very few places in the world would have understood those ideas. Today, we kind of get that, right? So I kind of want to walk you through, and we'll start with another quote from John. He wrote to Abigail on the 3rd. The gang did not think the 4th mattered. The document was not really signed on the 4th. It was signed by the group in August. I think Hancock may have signed on the 4th. The 4th was just insignificant. It really only comes to us as an important day because that's the date the printer put on it, because that's when he printed that big piece. The date was the 2nd. And so John writes to Abigail and he says, look, yesterday the greatest question was decided which ever was debated in America, and he goes on, and greater perhaps never was or will be decided among men, among humans. A resolution was passed without one dissenting colony. You will see in a few days, meaning he's sending to her, a declaration setting forth the causes. There's actually, we'll show you in a second, there's the resolution saying we are going to declare ourselves independent. Then there is the written document that declares the causes. Those are actually two separate things that occurred. You'll see a declaration setting forth the causes which have impelled us to this mighty revolution and the reasons which will justify it in the sight of God and man. But this is good. This is, you quote this, I put this on Facebook and Instagram to show people this, but here's the part that's really important. He keeps going because he told her, look, what we're doing right now is we're setting forth the total structure of what it will take to be a nation, or a collection of nations, to be quite more accurate. We'll come back to that in a second. And so one of the things that he talked about was this idea to her, was that they had set in motion, when they set in motion to write the Declaration, they actually put together 3 committees. I'll show you this again in a second, just making the point. And one of those committees was to write our government. The thing we learned in middle school, or if we watched Schoolhouse Rock, was sort of like they wrote a declaration, thought about it for a while, and then wrote a government. Incorrect. Incorrect. From the beginning, they were thinking, if we're going to do this, because what they were doing, they were very clear. We are rebelling against the most progressive, most liberal, most freedom-centered government in the world. So if we're going to do that, we better have a good reason. And if we're going to do it, we need to think in terms of how do we make this happen and last. So one of the things they thought about from the beginning is we better have a government to replace the government we're rebelling against. So they did. Right? So then I want you to see this quote he says. He says, the new government we are assuming in every part will require a purification from our vices and an augmentation of our virtues, or there will be no blessings. Because, there's a because here, the people, meaning you and I, will have unbounded power. This is again the clue of what was being structured that had never really been seen on the planet since the Athenians and the Romans. And the people are extremely addicted to corruption and banality. And when he says as well as the great, he's meaning the people who were seen as the wealthiest and the powerful. And then this is the part I want you to get. He said, I'm not with that apprehension. This is the part I think we as Christians need to lean into. This kind of statement of faith that he makes here, right? But I must submit all my hopes and fears to an overruling providence in which, unfashionable as the faith may be, I firmly believe. And so I call that out to you as we stand in this day in 2026. You're not blind to the fact that we are in turmoil as a nation. I hopefully will have a slight moment to say, it's okay, because when they did this, roughly 40% of the nation was angry about it and was determined not to support it. The people that we can learn in middle school, the evil loyalists, they were just people who were saying, our government is a faithful and fair government. There's no reason to overturn it. So on July 4th of 1776, we were just as delighted as we are on July 4th, 2026. All right, so regardless of how you feel about the division or that your worries, I would suggest to us as Christians, we should submit all our hopes and fears to an overruling providence. That's their word for God, for our God. And for John, who is a firm Christian, he's meaning our Christian God. He's not meaning some just random, vague power in the universe. In which, so the submitting my hopes and fears to the providence, he's saying already, it's unfashionable as the faith may be. So I think for many people, myself included, we may feel like our faith is unfashionable. We may feel that our faith connected to our belief in what the government of the United States, in the broad sense of the government of the United States, not meaning any one person or party, is attempting to do, is a positive thing, right? I would also just say to you as we're going to go through this, I urge you to remember, we'll come back to this at the end, as Christians, that there are lots of people who take an opposite view. And there were many yesterday who were sad, who felt frustrated, who feel like we've fallen off. I would suggest to us that we need to, again, submit those same fears or concerns or worries, because many of those people are Christians that we will see in the afterlife. Whether we like to admit it or not, these are people of faith, and yet they perceive something's gone awry. We're not discussing whether those people or these other, whoever has the right view of that. I'm just submitting to you that that sense of that tension that we feel right now is not something to alarm us, but like John, and I think you're going to hear this when Preston's sharing too, we turn that all over to the Father. And we just put ourselves in a place where we say, I want to, like John Adams and others, be in prayer for God to do his thing. All right, so how did we get there? Like I said, it was divided. So we're going to be real super quick. Again, when Preston was like, do you want the road to the revolution? That's a several I can show you my video channel if you want to see some of these video talks, do those things. You've seen many things, I'm sure, on PBS and other places that kind of walk their way through it. This is what I consider to be the first American Civil War, or the fourth British Civil War. Most of the fighting occurred American colonists versus American colonists. Yes, there were some British soldiers. Yes, there were some mercenaries. There's always mercenaries. In one sense, as we got Native American allies, we had mercenaries, or the Patriots had mercenaries, that kind of thing. So there's other people, but most of the fighting was American versus American. And that's what you need to keep in mind. Again, the 6th grade version you might have learned is we were kind of minding our own business, and this evil country came from somewhere else and began to impose itself on us. False. If you've seen yet the movie Young Washington, they do a good job of pointing out that George was, as everybody else was, seeing themselves as a proud British citizen. And the frustration, you could argue, that leads into, at least by 73, 74, was this feeling of, they're never going to respect us. They're not going to see us as equal. And so then there's other factors, but it's one of the key factors. You can almost say the arrogance of the British and how they treated these kind of low-life nobodies, as opposed to wanting to respect them, played a huge role in leading to this division. A whole bunch of things happened from the end of the French-Canadian War through it's an argument by historians, I would say up until the Tea Act, which was a very offensive act we did against the government. Up to that point, there's a moment for reconciliation, and most people wanted it. But once the Tea Act comes, and then Parliament passes the Coercive Acts, from that point on, there's really no attempt at reconciliation. Ben Franklin, who's in London still at this point, before he set sail from London back home, I want to say in 74, might have been 73, he tries with his good friend Richard Howe, who eventually will be the admiral of the British Navy, who comes over to New York in July of 1776. And they'll meet again. And he is attempting, Ben, to say, here's a way forward. But it was really, he was missing this. There's no reconciliation, both from London's point of view and from our point of view. We had passed that moment. So a lot of the movement to the Declaration was men like John Adams, Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, Richard Henry Lee, trying to convince others in the room, hey, look, we're going to have to do this. But you'll see others in the room in Philadelphia still moving slowly, and you can almost see them saying, there's got to be a better way than war. That's kind of where they're at with the thinking and the process. So, then of course, in 1775, we have open bloodshed. So again, we've already passed the moment with the Coercive Acts, and then you get the thing with Lexington and Concord, leading to Bunker Hill. And at that point, again, most people, not all people, the British will consistently be leaning into finding the people who are loyal to the government, who still are proud of being citizens of the nation. They wouldn't use the word nation, but that's the idea. And getting them to help. That's what they're kind of leaning into to do. But for most people, it is that action of the British government and then responding in ways that in one sense is not their fault. Like let's say in Concord, it's not their fault. But nonetheless, by stumbling into that moment when there is bloodshed, to the average citizen, which probably was like today, a 30-40% are kind of like, oh, I don't care, I'm not paying attention. I'm playing on social media and I'm not really watching. And they're like, wait, they killed a bunch of people? That's not cool. And then they kind of move to that side, right? So in 1775, after Lexington and Concord, after Bunker Hill as well, Parliament comes into session. And the King gives a speech. He always gives a speech to open Parliament. King Charles III still does it. And so in giving that speech, he says openly that, look, the colonies are an open and avowed rebellion. So he calls it out. We've now moved to a point. Now, they're still thinking there's a few ne'er-do-wells like Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, John Hancock, who have led us to this point, but there's still a few. They're wrong on that. Again, the revolution is in all 13 colonies. We're an open and avowed rebellion. And he calls on Parliament to act. Parliament does act, and they pass what's called the Prohibitory Act. The Prohibitory Act, from an American point of view, was like a declaration of war. It was telling the British Navy, you can stop any American ship and you can take its possessions, you can take the ship, you can take anybody on the ship and use them. If you know your War of 1812 story, you know the story of impressment. That was happening at this moment. Hey, these people, well again, they're all British citizens. Britain's claiming, England's claiming, we're going to take them. So in early 1776, a series of things happened in the spring as the Second Continental Congress is still working its way through what it wants to do. Again, I stress to you, in the room, it was always a revolving cast. There's somewhere between 40 and 50 different people who were in the room as for the Second Continental Congress. In the room, you would have had really hardcore revolutionaries, and you would have had moderates, and at least initially, you would have had loyalists. So you had loyalists who were in the room trying to argue, this is wrong, we should not be doing this is going too far. Eventually, by the time you get into 76, most of the loyalists have been replaced by their states. They're like, hey, you're coming home, we're sending another person in your place. But even into the spring, you've got 4 or 5 states, all the middle colonies, so Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, they're all leaning moderate to loyal. South Carolina's mixed. Georgia's brand new. Remember, Florida at this point is an actual colony of England coming out of the British War. We want nothing to do with it. There's nobody living there. Montreal is also a colony of England. We think we can get them on our side. We're wrong. We're going to attempt to do that both with warfare and with diplomacy. We're going to send Ben Franklin up there. They're not listening. They're not interested. So they're staying where they are. And so there's this pressure building. Thomas Paine's Common Sense is a huge moment at this time, in January of 76, because you're really the first one to write in a way that A, speaks more directly to the people. There's lots and lots of writings. And the American colonists are generally, we could say, intellectual enough to read it. But it's almost like you could say, what Thomas Paine does is he goes on like Jimmy Kimmel, and he writes in the USA Today. Whereas John Adams and those guys have been on, PBS NewsHour and are writing for the New York Times. And, there may be an audience for those things, but the vast people are not watching PBS. They're not reading the New York Times, right? Today. Get the picture? I'm just a little redneck from Tennessee. Look, I wore patriotic socks just for you. This means yes. This means no. When I ask, I really want to make sure you hurry and go, yeah, I got it. So Paine's talking to the common person. And then secondly, Paine's main influence is that he's the first one to finger the king. He says the king is the problem. And then he's talking about the king being the problem in connection to this idea of monarchy being a problem. So he's openly saying the style of government that we've all been loyal to in itself is wrong. Now that's some philosophical debate that needs to be entered into, but he's saying it openly, and there's a sense in which the average person's reading USA Today going, really? Wow, okay. And so that kind of throws people in motion towards independence. So you got people like John Adams who are kind of beating the drum. Look, we've come to this place. There's no reconciliation. We have to make a move. So he does in May. So in May, he puts forward a resolution that calls for the formation of local governments. What it says basically is that the individual colonies need to assume all the powers of government. Now, what he's doing here is a reflection of how the colonists perceive themselves. And again, you saw the movie on Washington, he says it. Very end of the movie, he doesn't say, hey, we're here for the United States. He says we're here for Virginia. Right? The Virginia War, when I'm trying to get into it, the Virginia War cannot be understood well by saying it's France versus England. It's France, the Native Americans, their Royal Confederacy, England, and Pennsylvania, Virginia, and they're not working in concert. So they were establishing themselves as states. Now this is tough for modern Americans because we've all been brought up to see state as merely a small piece of a contiguous whole. Does that make sense? Like a little puzzle piece. That the whole is the point. We have this word nation that we use. That word wasn't even around really at this point, not in vogue. So what we need to keep in mind, I know a political scientist could argue this point with me, but in general terms, when we hear the word state, we need to see it as being equivalent to nation. So they were saying to the 13 nations, you need to establish yourself as independent. Hence the part about government.
Because men like John were like, once we've got 13 independent nations, we'll only survive if we work together. So we have to come up with some kind of government that can blend us together. And if you ever studied the constitutional journey, and you know the big fight, some of the major rock stars of the revolution opposed the second constitution because it was diminishing this idea of the states being, in essence, independent nations. But to get it, what they were thinking in 76 is basically a version of what we would see in the EU. Luxembourg's its own thing, Belgium's its own thing, the Netherlands is its own thing, Denmark's its own thing, France, you get the point, right? And then they work together, sort of. And the sort of is part of why we can go to the government. That's their conversation. But that's what he's asking to happen here. This was revolutionary, and when it passed 5 days later, he was accosted by one of the moderates. What are you doing? This is reckless. He said, this is like leading us to independence. And John said, no. This is independence itself. Now that we've passed this, we are independent. So later in his life, as the fame of July 4th built, remember, on July 4th, nobody cared. Nobody wrote any letters, nobody did anything, it wasn't important at all. They didn't even read it till the 6th, they didn't celebrate it till the 8th. John was more and more frustrated by things related to Thomas Jefferson. It's a different conversation. So he would often argue, May 15th ought to be our celebration. That's not what he thought at the time, though, because I showed you the quote that he wrote to Abigail on the 3rd, that the 2nd was an important day. But here he's writing to her in May, and this is him writing. He writes to his friend James Warren. And James says, he says to James, the Congress has passed the most important resolution that was ever taken in America. Now, if you ever read John Adams, you'll know that he is somebody given to hyperbole, and he gets excited. So he's going to have several in this 4-month window. This is the most important. This is the most important. No, this is the most important. So it's, when he's sad later that July 4th is being celebrated, sometimes it's kind of like, John, relax, it's okay. I get you, understand, I'm on your side. But he said, look, this is huge. So then, between May 15th and June 7th, he and the other patriots were like, we have to go forward even further. And so he works with his good friend from Virginia, Richard Henry Lee, and they put forth the resolution. So this is the resolution of our group-wide independence. So to separate what happens in June from May, think of it like I said, May is when the Congress was saying to each state, take your stance as an independent, I'll use our word, nation. And then in June, they're like, we want to make a collective statement from this Congress of the continent. So the Continental Congress. We will make our own statement that kind of makes a group declaration. Does that make sense? Everybody see what's happening here? So the resolution, remember the quote I showed you, the most important resolution was passed. And then later, you will see a declaration of of the reasons for our action. Right? So this is the resolution. That these united colonies, so now they're making a claim, united. Remember, that's a little dicey claim, because as I told you, about 40% of the people would have said, don't include me in that. We're not united on this point at all. These united colonies are, and of a right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state, there's your hint, Great Britain is a state, Virginia is a state, equivalent. The state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. So, wow, that's big. They're taking a bigger stance because previously, by dumping it off to the states, if I'm a moderate or maybe a pseudo-loyalist in the room, I could absolve myself and then try to work back at home and get us at home just to say, well, we're not doing that, whoever we might be. And now, they're asking me, as a member, as a delegate here that represents space, I'm going to have to vote on this. And so this is heavy. They're really feeling this. In fact, it was so heavy that they had a massive debate on June 8th, 1910. Back and forth, arguing with each other. Back and forth, back and forth. Finally, they decide, we're going to table this. If you've ever known Robert's Rules of Order, the whole reason you table something is because we can't decide. And we're arguing, and tensions are too high, and there's too much heat in the room, and we need to take a chill pill, just relax for a second. So they thought, you know what we'll do? What we're going to do is we're going to table, we're going to set up 3 committees, like I told you already. One to write a government, to see what that could look like. One to write rules for doing foreign policy, because we know if we're going to do this, we're going to need help. And the most likely candidate is our former enemy, France, who doesn't like us, but they hate England, so maybe they'll help us. So how are we going to do that? right? We don't have the money, so we're going to have to go to rich people like the Netherlands, or maybe Spain, or just no. But then thirdly, let's write down the reasons for the resolution. So the resolution is one thing, the declaration is the second. Does that make sense? So that's the way I do it. But either it's kind of hoping cooler heads will prevail. Every night, these guys were going out to eat, they were talking, they were going to church together, they were arguing with each other. So, there's a lot of politicking going on in the room, trying to figure out a way to navigate themselves forward. So, the committee for this, as you know famously, it's led by John Adams and Ben Franklin. Franklin was sick, and Adams was on like 25 other committees. He basically was the guy running the war, we would say, from Congress for the general, Washington, who's up in Boston. So he's like, I ain't got time for this. The writing of the Declaration was seen as relatively unimportant. So they knew the best writer in the room was Jefferson. From the moment he entered into Virginia politics, he was not a good speaker. He was not somebody who was a good leader in the sense of rallying others to him, right? Like Washington just walked in a room and everybody's like, yeah, you're in charge, right? But he was amazing with the pen. And from Virginia, and he had written several other documents. Most importantly, he had written a document called a summary review of the complaints, basically. And it was like bestseller across the United States. And so he was asked to be the draftsman. Now there's a big, huge, famous historical debate which we won't get into. Jefferson and Adams will go from being friends, close colleagues, to deep enemies, mostly because Jefferson betrayed Adams. There's a lot of other things that are in the story, but as they go into the 1800s, as I've already alluded to, they will take widely different viewpoints to the importance of this thing. So Adams, always in the thought process of defending himself, was quick to always say, well, this and this and this and this and this happened. And Jefferson, tired of being asked about it, would just be like, look, I don't know, they asked me to write it. That's all I'm going to say. But he was frustrated with how it had worked out. There was a lot more that we could say there. So he goes back to his room. If you ever go to Philadelphia, and you go to the State House, and you will stand there and look at the State House, right? From like in the grassy area that's there, to your back corners where the Liberty Bell is. You've been there, right? That street that you can't drive on. But if you walk about 2 blocks up that street, that's where Jefferson is. He rented 2 rooms. So he takes there and he writes. Works about 10 to 12 days. He wasn't only working on the draft. I always laugh and get mad at the same time when I see people put up those little things on social media, like July 3rd, and Jefferson goes, that's due tomorrow? Because it was presented in June. And so, anyway. Know your history, people. So he, of course, the other 2 guys are insignificant. And he wants to show it to Franklin and Adams. And you can see his quote there. He was desperate for their insight. They both give him advice. You may have seen paintings of the 3 of them in a room talking. They were never together because, again, Franklin was sick. So he was always in his bed. He and Adams met, had some conversations and stuff, kind of worked their way through it. In the end, they produced the document. Jefferson himself added some more pieces to it, finally presents it, and they present it to the group. You can see that Adams thought it was good. He thought the high tone and flights of oratory were important. What most people don't realize, and if you do want to hear more lectures, on Saturday in Winter Park Library, I began doing a lecture there, and we're going to look at the Declaration. We're going to spend most of the time, we're going to read the entire Declaration as a group on the microphone. We're going to pass it around, make everybody read in the room. We're going to talk about what it actually says. Most people know the preamble. That's the high flights of oratory part that Adams is talking about. But really, 2/3 of it's legal brief. So Scott, as a lawyer, he would get this. When you're trying to present what is going on and why, here's the members of the jury, blah, 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 blah. But now I'm going to get to my evidence. And bam, 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 bam. 20 plus statements of here's the evidence, kind of thing. When you look at those, most of those are welcome. I like Adam's quote here. There are other expressions which I would not have inserted, particularly that which called the king a tyrant, as I thought the expression too passionate. What he's really saying is, I don't actually think the evidence is good that he's a tyrant, but that's part of the conversation. So, this is the famous part. Hopefully you know this. Hopefully you've seen this more than one time. Let's hear it. When in the course of human events become necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they, these people, should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. They go on and they make a series of claims. We'll go back to these in a minute. But all these truths be self-evident. All men are created equal. There's a very famous ongoing debate. What do they mean by men? We're not going to get into that, but just know it's there. They're endowed by their creator. All the capitalism that you see is their choice. So laws of nature, nature's God, providence, supreme judge, later here, creator. They're all leaning in on these words that they use to describe God in a more neutral setting. They're not in church. And they've been endowed with certain rights: life, liberty, pursuit, happiness, stealing that from Locke. Most of what Jefferson wrote was not his own original thoughts, but that would have been true if Franklin or Adams had written it, because they were leaning in on a lot of the writings of the time, of the thinkers of the time, both American and European, about, well, what does it mean for humans to live in a civic space together? What should that look like? How do you do that? And so men like Montesquieu and Locke and Hobbes and others have written saying, well, here's different thoughts about those things. They go on and talk about how these rights, governments are instituted among men, here's the key phrase, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governor. Go back to that in a second. Then a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, and evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. If you like the Nicolas Cage movie, you might have watched it this weekend, where they're looking for the secrets on the back of the Declaration of Independence. That's the quote he gives the girl in the dressing room. She's like, you don't talk like that anymore. Right? This is the key, right? We have to give them, we say that there's a long train, meaning multiple, abuses and usurpations. Abuses on us and usurping power that we think belongs to us. So we have to prove those things. We think it's going to the same object, a design to put us under absolute despotism. So we're going to have to do what? We're going to have to let facts be submitted to the king of the world. So they do in 27 different points. There are 3 groups. First group, if you read, it's all he has, he has, he has, he has. The middle section is basically blaming him for acts of parliament. So it's really interesting maneuver on their part to try to remove parliament from the conversation and put all the blame on the king. And then the final kind of loops it back in, really talking about the most recent things that have been done in terms of the war itself. And there's a whole other conversation we're not going to get into about the validity of these. I just will say what I've already noted to you. When you look at these logically, both in time and space, when they're happening, and the charges being made, most of them don't hold up. Meaning a lawyer, a judge would have said, sorry, Scott, your case is weak because the facts are here, here, and here. But that didn't matter. One thing that's really good about seeing this is, remember, it's a civil war, right? So you're really dealing with 2 different perspectives. Was yesterday a day to celebrate? Was yesterday a day to be sad? Well, it depends on who you're asking. That's just the bottom line. You don't have to like it. If you're on whichever side you're on, or you can be in the middle. You'd be like, But if you're just be fair to humans, you're like, okay, well, that person's got a different perspective than I do. I want to know what they're feeling. Why do they feel that way? Right? But that's what we should do, but we don't typically do. Right? We typically just accuse and belittle, or I'm not going to talk to you anymore. So we had a viewpoint about what was happening to us. And the British had a completely different viewpoint. And you can read more about that if you want to dig into the charges. However, it worked. The king, from the time of Thomas Paine, I'm writing Common Sense to this point, becomes in the minds of people the guilty culprit. It's all his fault. And you begin to have people taking, like the day it's read aloud in New York, they tear down a statue famously of the king that had just been put up, and then they made bullets and cannonballs out of it. There's a whole bunch of opposition to him, and in the minds of most Americans in 1776, the king, King George III, becomes a tyrant who is doing despotic things to us. So this is what's going to be debated. It's presented on June 28th, then they wait over the weekend, July 1st, give every time to read it, but also some time. July 1st, they come together to debate the meeting. The defense goes first, or I should say the prosecution goes first. And John Dickinson from Pennsylvania becomes the leading spokesperson. He won't be the only person who speaks, but he gets up first. Then speaks passionately and well and wrote privately, this is probably the end of my reputation, I'm probably going to lose everything. He'll actually leave Pennsylvania after this to move to Delaware because of the opposition. But he will fight in the revolution, he will be a soldier who participates in Washington's army. So even though he opposes the Declaration, he is, in his mind, a faithful citizen to this new thing, because I live here, it's where I'm staying. I can live in Pennsylvania more, like people like me there because of this. I moved to Delaware, but he'll be a faithful participant. But he gets up and he says, look, this is too soon, and we're basically making a boat out of paper. The moment we put out to sea, we're doomed. We're doomed. We cannot win this, and I don't think that the charges we're making are legitimate. He finishes. Clouds begin to form outside. A storm, rainstorm is coming in Pennsylvania. Everybody's sitting there looking at John Adams. John's looking at somebody else. Not that I don't think he wanted to do it, but he often thought, I speak too much anyway, so people think I'm obnoxious. But finally he sits there and he goes, okay. So he gets up. And for the next hour, hour and a half, he walks through all the charges, walks through all the story that had happened in his mind starting in 61, not 63, working their way through as to why we're here doing what we do. Thunder clouds are coming in now. Now lightning and thunder is happening outside while he's speaking. Several people, well, 3 or 4 people came in late while he was talking, only for the last 15 minutes or so. Preston, you ready? This might happen to you today. And they say, give it to me again. And he looks around and he already sat down and goes, no. And they're like, well, we want to know what's been said. And one of the guys looks in the room and goes, you're the only one who really knows the whole story. So he then gets back up and gives both Dickinson's arguments. Here's what Dickinson said, and then here's what I said. So he's on his feet for about 2.5, 3 hours. I don't know if you ever had to do any law cases like that. We didn't know you could judge that long. So Preston, get ready to have to do the sermon twice. If we don't hear it, well, somebody comes in late. As you can see from his friends, Adams is the hero of the American Revolution. This is one of the great tragedies about our story. It makes me so sad when I'm so convinced about John Adams. Who's on Mount Rushmore? Jefferson. Don't get me started. And Washington. Washington, I get it. Why do we have an American nation? John Adams. Now, Washington's critical for what happens without him. We don't win without him. But we don't even get there in the sense of running the race without Adams. The vote goes in positive. 9 in favor, 3 against, 1 abstention. But they're like, oh, shoot, we're going to do something this big. We probably need to unite. So they postpone. So it's technically passed, but they're like, I don't think this is right. That night, word gets to them that the British fleet has arrived in New York, to Washington is at this moment with the soldiers. They've successfully taken Boston. They moved to New York. Because again, New York is a loyalist place. But holding New York City or Manhattan in the harbor, crucial to the strategy the British had, which was basically to divide the land and keep New England, which they thought really were all the troublemakers, keep them isolated from everybody else. So they're there, and it's a massive fleet. Had they sent this fleet and this army 3 years before, we would not have had a revolution at all. But they failed to pick up on that. So now, not only is it like, we're not sure we want to do this, it's not just a game we're playing, which is words written down. They're for real. They're coming. Right? You already knew that with the Battle of Bunker Hill. They advanced 3 times on the ground, lost over 150 men, killed, and more than that, total wounded, and still they took the ground. So they're not giving up. And so now, are you sure you want to sign this? Or are you sure you want to go down this road? So the kind of ominous in the room. They go away. That night, some conversations happened with Dickinson and some others in Pennsylvania. We're not sure exactly what was said. We don't have any evidence to suggest there were some threats that were made. But in the morning, when they came back together, both Dickinson and one of his other moderate loyalist friends did not come back. Pennsylvania had 7 representatives, so their vote had been 4-3. 4 against, 3 in favor. With those 2 guys gone, it shifted to 3 in favor to 2 against. Pennsylvania changed. When Pennsylvania changed, South Carolina announced they would make a change also. Delaware, I guess, technically didn't vote no because they were 1-1, but a 3rd representative named Caesar Rodney had ridden 80 miles over the night, like 4 or 5 different horses, arrived, mud spattered, walked in the room, was like, I'm here, I'm voting yes. Had been sent by Delaware's, again, Delaware's one of the middle colonies, they've been opposed, but he shows up, they've made a change, they vote yes. New York's the abstaining one. They abstained mostly because Albany was against independence, the short version. But the representatives of the room are like, we're with you, and we will sign on the declaration. So the final vote is 12-0-1. So when he writes to Abigail and says no dissenting colony, he's not thinking about New York. He's not thinking about the three that had voted no before. And then over July 2nd, 3rd, they added it down to the document we have today. The document we have today is not the document that Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson wrote. All right. Then it's voted on the 4th. That's why it's signed on the 4th. The date is put on the 4th. The process. Printed publicly, meaning in the newspapers on the 6th. Sent to all the colonies. Washington gets his copy in New York on the 9th. Assembles all his troops, reads it aloud. Abigail happens to be in Boston on, I'll come back to this in a second, on the 18th. When she was there on the 18th, Boston was when it was read aloud in Boston. So the different colonies are getting it and seeing this has been set. So they're kind of out there in the process. The 8th is when they have the declaration read aloud. And again, for Adams, and for most people, the 2nd was the crucial day. The day they came back, they voted unanimously, which is why it says on there unanimous at the top of it before you get into the document itself. Yep. Now, that's all, that's the issue. Now, what about us? What about us now? I told Preston, let's talk about how we got there, but let's talk, what does it mean for us? Just the short time we have left now before we go over to the sanctuary for service. All right, what does it mean? Well, if you were here a year and a half ago, we talked in here in the Sunday school class that I was leading about like what does it mean for us to be a Christians in this place? And when we look at the revolutionary documents, what are they trying to do? It's a long conversation we don't have time for. I think it's fair to say that they were trying to find a way to create something new that had not previously existed. That was both an adherence to their belief in God and an acceptance that not everybody believes in God, and you can be a faithful citizen if you don't, which was unique in the world at that time. Because every other nation had a god or gods, and you were obliged to believe in them in some capacity through some actions that you take. So there's not an effort by them writing this to say, we are a Christian nation. That's just historically inaccurate. There's not an effort for them to say, we need to defend God in this, or we need to somehow claim all of this is because of God. That's not what they're doing. But there are hints of how deeply the Christian faith was embedded in the foundation of who these people are. And that's the part that's also must be defended or stated. Well, one of the best ones is from Jefferson, who's not a Christian at all. Trust me, I can tell you. Not at all. And would never claim to be. He wrote, so we say these truths are self-evident. That's a Franklin phrase. Franklin was afraid it was too religious the way that Jefferson had written. Because what Jefferson had written is we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. And using sacred meaning the connection to this is coming from God. And Franklin was like, let's not do that. And I point out to you again to say, here's Jefferson, who's not a Christian like Adams is, not fervent in his faith. And yet he's acknowledging God's in the mix here. He's the one who wrote, endowed by their creator. So he's thinking about where God plays a role in this. And then more importantly, for where we go forward in 2026, is to recognize the unique thing that I mentioned at the very beginning, which is what were they saying? They were saying that each individual, having been created by God, is a being of worth. We would say something like, is the divine spark, carries the image of God. Every person on the planet, the grossest mass murderer, is created by God and carries then that image and spark of God. No matter how you and I might think they're very warped now, from God's point of view, he still created him or her. And they're then arguing, and this is coming from a long history of Christian unique stances that we took coming early on in the faith. They're arguing that, look, if that's true, then because these beings, these humans, have purpose in their life itself, then they should have the capacity and invitation to participate in civic governance. As opposed to the typical monarchical or worldwide view of what I like to call the power pyramid. But in the Middle Ages of European thought, it's also true in Asia, the leader was brought down by God. And so you have a king because God placed the king there. So that's your allegiance to God by being allied to the king. But in the process, the people become insignificant or irrelevant. And what comes out of the Christian story, lost, ebbs and flows, never done perfectly, not done perfectly in 1777. Again, the debate, well, all of you women should be saying, well, they weren't letting us vote. And that's a fair complaint. But what we wrote was something aspirational to kind of move us forward. But at any rate, so once you really lock in on this, they're saying that government comes from the consent of the governed, meaning every person, the richest to the poorest, the best person, oh, Carl's such a good boy, to the darkest person, he said that person's a terrible person, you put in jail. They are the governed. And so then they should have, within reason, depending on the setting, some capacity to participate. Maybe the kids are too young to fairly do it. So maybe we need to wait on maybe a mass murderer gives up their right to participate, but these are like unique moments that set them aside. They would have had an answer for us about the women, not one that at least I would like or agree with, but we're saying they would have an answer for that. So then you keep going forward, and the committee steps in. It's not correct to say Thomas Jefferson is the author of the Declaration. Please do me a favor for the rest of your life. Never, ever, ever say that. You can say he's the draftsman, but even that's not fully accurately historically. The document that we cherish as the Declaration was written by the Second Continental Congress. The committee participated. They went over every word. Adams was defending it at every moment, but they went over every word, every phrase. They changed. What the document we have is a document they wrote that was drafted first by Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin. And so the committee was determined at the end, when you get to the very end, after you get through all the laws, there's a closing argument for the judge. And they talk about first that they're appealing to the supreme judge of the world. And you knew precisely who they were turning to. They were turning to our God, to their God. The God they would have said brought them there and gave them that land, or at least allowed them to live on that land. This idea of appealing to the supreme judge for his protection and intervention. And in one sense, they're saying, we could be wrong, so we're looking to you as the judge. If we lose, we will probably recognize we were wrong. Right? Does that make sense? So they're saying, okay, you're the judge, you're the God, you rule over all things, you decide. And this was stated all the time in the colonies, from pulpits. And you're going to hear a somewhat patriotic message today. I mean, Preston just generally is patriotic, but today's message is going to be very patriotic. Don't go, oh wow, I wish you wouldn't get on political, I wish you wasn't patriotic. That's what pastors did all the time, particularly at this point, trying to defend this movement to the revolution. And then at the end, they inserted this phrase, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. That's not what Jefferson wrote. But the men in the room said, look, we're going to do this, we're probably going to lose. And you probably heard the phrases, the times they talked to each other and said, we better stand together or we'll hang separately kind of thing. They literally did think they would probably die. Nobody walked out of the room going, we're going to win. It's probably going to not work out, but we think we're compelled to make this effort. But let's see if we can appeal and have a firm reliance on him. And this should remind us of why the revolution matters. It's calling out that individuals have purpose and worth, and that everyone gets to participate in the civic structure. The Declaration becomes like this kind of viewpoint from which there's no backing down. We're either going to win or lose on the battlefield. And it is at this moment that when you're studying this, you turn to the battlefield, because all this is worthless if we don't win on the battlefield. So there's a whole further conversation about that. There's an enduring legacy that I think goes beyond what most of them were thinking. Most of them were not proceeding in this way. Again, they're trying to make an argument for why we are declaring ourselves independent. I can't stress for you enough how dicey a position it was for them to take this stance. This was not casual. They were not being cavalier. This would mean, more than likely, their own deaths before firing squad, loss of all their land, loss of everything that they thought was dear to them. And so that's why you have people going, even if I maybe agree, I don't know if I want to sign on the dotted line. But this idea goes beyond what they were thinking. In other words, they're thinking, let's prove why we can govern without the king. And what it really becomes, I would say, there's this philosophical reading of governance, the ideas I've been stressing, that the individual matters, that each individual matters, and that is exclusively a Christian concept. Oh yes, today, lots of people, I know the UN's got a Declaration of Human Rights. Guess where they got all that from? Not America, but from Christianity. They got it from Christianity. We're the ones saying, hey, look, if this is true about this guy Jesus, this is what this means for you and me. And we see this when you read all through the Scripture. And so when you come back to this phrase about all men being created equal, I like how John Adams wrote it. He's writing, this is later in his life, the radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution. Change in what way? Change from a belief in the system that everybody knew, the power pyramid. There's a king on top, given there by God, that's all I have to worry about. And my life doesn't really matter. To this idea of, oh wait, I matter, and I can participate in this system. So then this, he writes to Patrick Henry on June 3rd. Yeah, on June 3rd, he writes to Patrick Henry. And he says this, they're writing about the government. This is in 76. The decree is gone forth, and it cannot be recalled, that a more equal liberty than has prevailed in other parts of the earth must be established in America. I love that. A more equal liberty. Meaning, nobody gets to claim that somehow they're more important than anybody else. And so then this, for you and me, should lean us back into the idea of what it means to be a Christian. And again, when I did the teaching here, I mentioned to you the letter to Diognetus. It's one of the early historical documents we have about what the faith looked like. This is around, he wrote about 150, between 130 and 150 AD. What did Christian faith mean for a people living somewhere? This is tough for us on the day that we celebrate, which we should celebrate, our nation. But it's still something I feel like I'm bound, I need to tell you, right? Our allegiance is not to this nation. Our allegiance is to our God. And that our God has called us to Him and revealed Himself to us. So we take the steps that we take in order to reflect Him, this upside-down worldview, to others. This is what 1 Peter's writing about. And Diognetus is really echoing what 1 Peter talks about. Go read 1 Peter. Really stay in 1 Peter for a while. If you really want to think, how am I supposed to be operating in 2026 in a divided country and worries about where stances are with my faith? Where does my loyalty lie? And Peter talks about this. And I'll leave you with this. We are people of the way. Today in the Bible app, if you're on the Bible app like I am, the verse of the day was Luke 29:24. 23 is the, if you will come after me, deny yourself, pick up your cross, follow me, kind of thing. And the 24 is the one that goes on and says, look, if you try to save your life on your own efforts, you'll lose it. The only way to save your life is to give your life away. Right? Well, who are we supposed to give our lives away for? Well, the Bible's all full of that, obviously, which I know you know. Go read Micah 6:8 if you need it. In fact, I've got it right here. I'm going to read 6:6, but I'll come back in a second. The idea that we get to live in this country, to me, is a massive blessing. I feel so blessed to have been allowed to be born here. And not everybody's born here, but we welcome them to come here. We want all to be open to coming here. But in the end, for me at least, me and my house, my allegiance is to God. My allegiance is not to the nation. My allegiance is not to the Declaration of Independence. It's strongly, I feel that. When I think about walking on the way and what He's called us to, when I think about the person who thought yesterday was a terrible idea, and it breaks my heart reading some things that people who I love wrote, it's like, oh, really? And I want to talk to them one-on-one to try to maybe help them see something else. But regardless, I'm called to love them. And I just thought this is worth saying. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. True life comes in Christ. True liberty when we die to self. And true pursuit of happiness, well, I'm going to close with this. Micah 6. I'm going to start on 6:6, because 6:8 gets lost if you don't read 6:6. Micah says, what can we bring to the Lord? What kind of offering should we give Him? Should we bow before God with offerings of yearling calves? Should we offer Him thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Should we sacrifice our firstborn children to pay for our sins? Oh, do you quote the rest? No. Oh, silly human. The Lord has told you what is good and what He requires of you. To do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. At the end of John Adams' life, he's writing to his granddaughter Caroline. He asked him about mysteries of life, and he's like, as old as I am now, I don't know much more. And he quotes Micah 6:3. So he said, like, this is what I know. There's a lot of things that I get frustrated about, a lot of things that are confusing to me, a lot of things that didn't work the way I wanted to. And there's times when I wonder why and why and why, and what should I do? And at the end of it is people of the way. And again, go read the Beatitudes, go read other verses. But we walk out of here, hopefully very proud of living in this country and proud of what we've accomplished in our short 250, you know it's very short, right? In our short 250 years. As we look to the future, what should we be known as? People who trumpet the declaration? I would say no. The people who trumpet the way of the Lord. As a people who loves the lost, the least, my neighbor who frustrates me, my relative who's annoying, the person who's different view from me, the widow, the outcast, the orphan. Let me pray. Father God, we love you so much. We glorify your name. Thank you for how good you are to us. You are the faithful King. You are the reason that we are even here. You're the one who gives us life. And you've given life to every person on the planet. Even people who I think maybe don't like me, or who maybe I don't like, or who I'm frustrated with, or who are frustrated with me. And God, I come to you hoping to live as Micah encouraged us, as you told him to tell us. And Father, I celebrate this nation. I celebrate the Declaration of Independence. I'm thankful for the actions of these men and women who participated as our founders to start this journey. And as we look ahead, we continue to see this document in its aspirational tones. And we continue to recognize we're going to argue and wrestle with each other about definitions of words. You, Father, give us that ability. Help us to lean into Psalm 1:2, that my delight is in you and in your ways, and I meditate on your ways, so that then, as Proverbs said, I cannot lean to my understanding, but you, Father, will make my path straight in how I act and how I am in my neighborhood, in my office. Thank you so much for this church that is in love with you. And Father, I praise you for this moment and this day, and ask you to be with us as we go now in a few minutes over to the sanctuary and the service. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.